Now, when Korea becomes a protectorate of Japan, a lot of those meddling reforms that the Japanese have been trying to force through in the latter half of the 19th century become far more explicit. They eventually adopt the Japanese yen, I believe. There's a Bank of Joseon, which is his name, but it's actually controlled by the Japanese. The Japanese are interspersed throughout the government even before full annexation in 1910. And basically, the gloves are off. 1907, King Kojong is forced to resign. What's the word for a king resigning? Abdicate. That's the word I was looking for. King Kojong is forced to abdicate. And like I said, those remnants of resistance in 1908 are expelled by the Japanese. There's an armed resistance to the Japanese in 1905 until about 1908, when those last remnants are sent up into Manchuria and even further on into Siberia. And it is around this time the Japanese can finally do what they always wanted to do in the first place, which is completely annex Korea into their empire. And they do so in 1910, in the month of August, in case you'd like to be super specific about it. Part of this 1910 Japanese-Korean treaty says that they have, quote, sovereignty over the whole of Korea. Quote, Japan shall undertake the entirety of the Korean government. And why? Why are they doing this? Besides the fact that they obviously want to, and they've been planning this for a long time, why do they do it? They do it because, quote, the existing government has not proved entirely equal to the duty of preserving order. Now, I don't speak, read, or write Japanese nor Korean, so I'm relying on a translation here. But man, is that sassy. I mean, you've already taken Korea, right? You're gonna have control of Korea. You're annexing it. You've got all the power in this situation. And do you want to formally end Korea's independence, so to speak, by dunking on them, by being like, your government hasn't proved entirely to the duty equal to the task of preserving order? Oof. I mean, that's just brutal. And brutal is the right word to describe what the Japanese do to Korea over their 35 years of annexation and direct control. They're going to hold Korea until 1945, and there's going to be a few different sort of phases that historians categorize the Japanese imperial time. There's going to be a period between like 1910 and 1920. There's a period between 1920 and 1930, and then finally a period between 1930 and 1945, which is going to represent the most brutal exploitation of Korea. But that is not to say that the period directly after annexation is particularly liberal. Not at all. First of all, the Japanese send a governor general into Korea. The person who runs Korea on behalf of the Empire Japan is always a high-ranking military man who has broad powers within Korea to do as he pleases. He's the chief administrator responsible to the emperor, I presume, of Japan, or at least, if memory serves, he responds directly to a person who then directly responds to the emperor. Nonetheless, he has full legislative, bureaucratic, administrative, executive powers over the whole of the Korean peninsula, over the whole of this annexed Korean part of Japan. Now, in one of the sources that I worked with, which was, hold on one second. Okay, so I worked on a book. I worked through a book called A Handbook of Modern Korean History. It was edited by Seth. I worked through that at the Library of Congress. If I have a picture, I'll put it up just for fun. And there was a chapter written by a Mark Caprio, a historian, who says that, and I'm quoting him as a secondary source because, again, I can't access the primary sources. I don't read Korean and Japanese, but the idea of Japanese, the stated idea is full assimilation. Full assimilation is the stated goal. An attempt at more full assimilation of the Koreans, insofar as it can go, we'll get a little more specific, really doesn't start to take hold until Japan needs the Koreans for their war machine in the 30s and 40s. And up until that point in time, the Japanese rule, particularly in the early days, are simply characterized by a domination of all aspects of society. So they're going to have control over the government, obviously. So they're going to have political control over Korea. They're also going to have control over the education system. There are eventually going to be Japanese language schools in Korea. I tried to make that clear. I think I just made it uglier. Whatever. There is going to be a domination via Japan in the economy of Korea. In fact, the Japanese are going to transform the Korean economy. We talked earlier about all of the sort of modest reforms towards the end of China's influence Korea, and then in the Empire of Korea period, when there is, a more cosmopolitan vibe in Seoul. There are trams being built. There's lots of railways being built by all these imperial powers. There's telegram lines. There's an abolition of like child marriage and slavery. And there's basically an emergence or a leaving behind of those Neo-Confucian traditions, including the Yangban class, who lose to a certain extent, at least on paper, they lose their hereditary rights to dominate the vast peasantry of Korea. And it is when the Japanese arrive for the very explicit purpose of building empire, and building empire to what end? Well, in this case, they see Korea as a breadbasket, or should I say a rice bowl. The exports that are going to come from Korea to Japan are going to be in the form of rice. The first thing the Japanese do when they arrive in Korea to be the dominant power, to be the imperial overlord, is they start a comprehensive land survey in the same year as annexation takes place, 1910. And it goes on for several years. I want to say it goes on to like 1920 or 1918 or something like that. There's a comprehensive land survey in which the Japanese, who are well aware that the last survey at the end of the 19th century and the one before that in 1820 were somewhat imprecise and often subject to the whims of the Yangban class, who wanted to keep their taxes low. The Joseon dynasty at the end of its rule was subject to a lower tax intake. It was part of the reason it declined. The Yangban, these hereditary feudal overlord Neo-Confucian hierarchical types, even though they're below the hierarchy of the king, in the Joseon period, they obviously want to protect their economic interests. They want to pay lower taxes. They want to extract more rents from the peasants and then keep more of it for themselves. That's, I guess, just how things tend to work. And the Japanese are well aware of all of that. And they come in and they say, no. Let's be comprehensive here. I want to know. We want to know. The Governor General wants to know. The Emperor of Japan wants to know. Every last little square inch, I'm using imperial measurements, every acre. I don't know what the Japanese or Korean term for or for measuring something approximating an acreage is. They want to figure out the entirety of Korea. And like I said, so that they can maximize the exports that they get from Korea. You have a society that has been, think about like your random villager, right? Way outside Seoul, somewhere in Korea. And for literally centuries, their family has been a tenant farmer in a certain place. And their connection to the outside world is only really through their Yangban overlord, to whom they pay taxes. They're aware of the king. They consider themselves to be under the king's hierarchy, right? And in the 19th century, especially in the late 19th century, a distinct sense of a Korean nation state obviously starts to emerge. But before that, for centuries and centuries, this peasant and its family, obviously no peasants living for centuries, but they are isolated. They are living on the land. And over the course of the 19th century and then going into Japanese rule, everything's starting to become connected, right? Telegram lines, railways, roads are being built. And the Japanese come in to conduct a land survey to figure out every square inch of the peninsula of Korea to maximize rice exports. Now, what happens? As part of this land survey, a Western-ish system of law, remember, Japan is becoming much more Western in its legal ways after the Meiji Restoration, after Japan starts to build its empire. And so during this land survey, it's required that if you own land, If you're a Yangban, you got to speak up and say, hey, this is my land. If you're a peasant and you want to claim land, you have to navigate the complicated Western legal world to do that. And presumably you are illiterate, and it will be hard to prove that, even in the best of circumstances. But even harder when you have your Yangban landlords all around who are probably the only literate people who are going to want to take a larger share for themselves. And most importantly, it's going to be hard when the Japanese imperial government wishes to become a large owner of land in itself in Korea. And in fact, at the end of this land survey, not only are peasants going to become much more exploited in terms of the rents being pulled out of their land, their acreage that they farm, there are exorbitant rents. Rent being like the amount of your crop that you give up each year to either your Yangban, who now no longer has, who's now like a petit bourgeoisie. He's more of a capitalist landlord as opposed to like a traditional feudal landlord. The amount that you give to that person, or the amount you give to the Japanese imperial government that directly controls your land, is exceedingly high to the point where Bruce Cummings in his Origins of the Korean War, I believe, talked about how every harvesting season or every planting season, I can't recall, it's like spring starvation, I think was the term, is basically like there's a period of time every year that you've given up so much of the crops that you've grown that you yourself are starving. You're like rummaging for food. And even though you've grown presumably more than enough to sustain yourself, you've had to give an immense amount of that away, either to this emerging elite that is, or Korean elite that's basically collaborating and exploiting this new system to build themselves up within this new imperial system, or to the Japanese government directly. And I think the number is like a plurality. I think the Japanese government, the imperial government, ended up owning about 40% of the land after this survey. So the largest landowner in the entirety of Korea is the Japanese imperial government. You can see how this heritage land, these centuries of the Joseon dynasty that have created this equilibrium, stagnant almost society that has just gone on and on and on for centuries, has been fundamentally disrupted by this reordering. On top of that, as I said, everything's interconnected. The Japanese are also particularly interested in building up industry, in building up Japanese-owned firms within Korea to fund their war machine. Now, this is more of a development of the 1930s, but the industrialization process, particularly in the northern part of Korea, what will become North Korea, is quite immense. In fact, at the end of World War II in 1945, the majority of the electricity, hydroelectric, being produced in Korea is in the northern part of the peninsula, so north of the 30th parallel. The majority of like factories and industry are also in that area, just more or less by coincidence as far as I can tell. And what is occurring then is that your peasants are either being further exploited if they're remaining in agriculture, or in like the 1930s in particular, going into especially the 1940s, the average Korean is either being exploited more on their land, or, they're now becoming part of what you might call in Marxist term, a working class, a emerging, dare I say, proletarian within Korea that is working in factories. And even at times going to the quote unquote motherland, the Japanese mainland, to work in factories there. And as you might imagine, the conditions aren't particularly great. And I'm leaning a lot on Bruce Cummings' work here just to cite that again. But as I said, I had a number of sources. I was going to list some more, but I'll just go to the description. And in the first decade of Japanese rule, 1910 to roughly 1919, there is the land survey, there is the beginning of industry, and there is the imposition of the Japanese imperial rulers on government education. Also, they impose themselves on places like the origins of culture. So Korean language newspapers are suppressed, and of course the actual narrative about what's going on, control of the newspaper media, is done via the Japanese government. There's also a Japanese colonial police force that starts to be born in this period. The beginning of Japanese rule in 1910, there's about 10,000 administrators that originally show up to participate in the Japanese imperial project in Korea. By the time that the Japanese Empire falls at the end of World War II in 1945, there are 700,000 administrators of the Japanese Empire. About a third of them, 250,000 or so, are actually Japanese, and then another 2/3 are then quote-unquote collaborators or quote-unquote native Koreans. I have to be really careful with my language, that are helping the Japanese to administer their empire. This is, from what I was reading, distinctly different in that Japan is very close to Korea, and so by directly ruling it just across the water, they can just have a much more hands-on approach, as opposed to, think of like the British Raj, where you have to go halfway around the world. So you're much more reliant on just local administrators, a light touch approach, just out of necessity, because you just can't have such quick and constant contact. You can't just send someone and have them be in the empire, in the place being administered on a quick basis. And there's another reason why that's important, and that is because it is important to the Japanese after 1919 to build up a group of Koreans who are actually dependent on the Japanese imperial system. There is an uprising in March of 1919. I wish it was 1916, because then it'd be like almost right, because then it would be like the same year as the Easter Rising in Ireland, and it'd be kind of cool. But it's not. It's March 1919. About estimates of like 500,000 to 1 million Koreans take to the streets and demand an end to the Japanese Empire, or a softening of that imperial rule. And the Japanese obviously put that down. And so in 1919, there's a Provisional Republic of Korea government that is formed in Shanghai. And one of the people present at the formation of that provisional government is a man by the name of Syngman Rhee. Syngman Rhee, who's going to be the first president of the Provisional Republic of Korea government in Shanghai. There is, in the 1920s then, the birth of Korean nationalism on steroids, of serious desire among Korean people to not just rid themselves of the Japanese, but to build a traditional Korean, traditional in the sense of like modern nation state and modern nationalism, a Korean national identity in which the Koreans rule themselves. And the Japanese realized then, after this big moment in 1919, that they might need to soften a little bit, that they've controlled everything and that they've imposed themselves directly on so much. They've taken the plurality of the land, and they have turned some people into workers, which is like taking them away from what they've known for generations, interconnecting Korea in a modern sense, and exporting lots and lots of rice to Japan. Things have been disrupted so much that you have this massive uprising. I think Korea is like 15 million people, roughly speaking, at the time of annexation, 1910. So having 1/15 of the population, or maybe 1/30 of the population, depending on the estimate, rise up is disturbing. And the Japanese, by softening, what I mean is that they are a little softer on the use of Korean language in the press. They're a little softer on the cultural stuff. And secondarily, they try to build a domestic base for their rule, a Korean group that are going to support Japanese rule and therefore to help negate future nationalist ambitions. So what does that actually mean in practice? It means a couple things. There's the, we'll call it lighter capitalist softening that the Japanese do, and that they allow certain Koreans to participate. Some of the old Yangban class who have presumably taken advantage of the land survey, they're allowed to start some businesses, to be like a small native Korean entrepreneurial class, even though the vast majority of business industry is going to be run by the Japanese in the imperial period. There's a petty bourgeoisie, to use a Marxist term. There is a group of people that are basically native Korean quasi-elites that can then be supportive of Japanese rule. And these will be later known as the collaborator the imperial dogs of the Japanese. They're going to be in trouble once the Japanese are gone, but for now they're going to prosper a little bit. The other set of collaborators to Japanese imperial rule are going to take the form of the colonial administrators. I mentioned that at the fall of the Japanese Empire in 1945, there's 700,000 Japanese administrators in Korea, and a third of them are Japanese, which means that 2/3 of them, so like 500,000 then, if my numbers are correct, are Korean themselves, administering the Japanese Empire. And a large and a good and a sizable number of them are part of a Japanese police force. And the Japanese colonial police force is therefore a way to make the Koreans enforce Japanese imperialism on the masses of Korea. And therefore, you can start to see how the Japanese are letting the native Koreans do the dirty work of empire for them. That secret police force is going to be pivotal in abolishing what is known as the Communist Party of Korea that forms in 1925 in Seoul. It's the first Communist Party of Korea because it's going to be subject to a series of arrests. It's going to try to reform itself, I think, in 1926, 2 more times. And then finally, a fourth Korean Communist Party is abolished in 1928, I think even at the behest of the Comintern, being like, you guys are just too dysfunctional, you keep getting arrested, you're too young, you're too disorganized, like, go away. But this Korean Communist Party in the 1920s represents a more extreme version of Korean nationalism that will take on the trappings of the Bolshevik Party of the Soviet Union and that particular brand of Leninist Marxism. What do I mean by that? In the Russian Revolution 1917, there were a grand series of different versions of communist and socialist parties. In fact, I have a book here, I just happen to have it sitting out, called 10 Days That Shook the World by John Reed, an American who was present during the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution of 1917. And he describes all the different communist parties that exist in this period of time. There are the Social Democrats, the International Socialists, the International People's Socialists, the People's Party of Judea, right? Just to reference Life of Brian. There's as many mutations of leftist parties as you can possibly imagine. And notably, there are the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. Trotsky was a Menshevik, eventually moved over to the Bolshevik Party. The most famous of the Bolsheviks, of course, is Vladimir Lenin. And Leninism represents a type of Marxism that says we can't just us organizing the masses, the working class, the proletarians towards revolution. We can't just expect that the consciousness is raised and then the revolution happens naturally, particularly in a place like Russia, where the majority of the population are not working class proletarians, but actually peasant farmers, poor peasant farmers. And so therefore, we can have a Marxist revolution before Orthodox Marxism would say we can have a revolution after we've gone through the natural stages of feudalism or proto-communism, feudalism, capitalism, and then eventually you have a proletarian revolution that brings about socialism. Everything is distributed according to need and everything is perfect, and then the state falls away and you have communism. We can skip the developmental step between feudalism and socialism. We can overstep capitalism by being a vanguard party. And the idea of Leninist revolutionism, that's not a term, but Leninism, the idea is that you can have a vanguard party that skips the line, so to speak, and leads a revolution on behalf of the workers and brings the state together to industrialize and basically speed runs through the capitalist step themselves. That's what the Bolsheviks do in 1917. They functionally stage a coup and they storm the Winter Palace and they take power on behalf of the workers and they present this fait accompli to all the other socialist and communist parties. And that's the origins of the Soviet Union. Now, by 1925, the Soviet the Russian Civil War is over. The Soviet Union definitely exists, and Lenin is dead, and there's Joseph Stalin is starting his time in power. But this idea of the vanguard is quite inspirational to the global South and other places that are quote unquote underdeveloped, they don't have a capitalist proletarian working class. The Korean communists being one set of those people, because Korea is industrializing. It is being industrialized by Japan, but the vast majority of Korea is still rural peasants. And so it is inspirational to a Korean communist to hear a vanguard Leninist theory that says we can have a communist revolution without waiting for industrialization to run its course, without waiting for that natural progression of Marxist history to play out. We can simply skip all those steps and have a revolution by raising class consciousness and by then staging a coup at some point. Now, you can see obviously why then the Japanese would be particularly interested in making sure this Communist Party never gets off the ground. But it's not just within Korea proper that communism is starting to take hold. And that is when we need to introduce a man by the name of Kim Song-ju, better known to us today as Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung is born in 1912 inside of Korea proper. You'll notice this is a couple years after annexation. His father is quite opposed to the Japanese imperial rule. We hear this through the official hagiography of the North Korean regime, but we also can assume that Kim Il-sung's father was opposed to Japanese rule because of, we can deduce that from his behavior. What do I mean by that? Well, in March 1919, after this uprising is put down, there is a large outflux, a large immigration with an E out of Korea to Manchuria of people dissatisfied with Japanese colonial rule, dissatisfied with the exploitation on the land, in the factories that are being built. And they want a place to either exist without that colonial rule at a minimum, or to actively resist in an armed way. Manchuria is, as we've probably already seen on the map, Manchuria is an area that is north of what today makes up the Chinese-Korean border. And we've already discussed how the Russians were ejected from it. The Chinese don't really control it, and Manchuria is kind of a no man's land in this period of time. And so therefore, it is a place for people dissatisfied with both the nationalist rule in China and the Japanese imperial rule in Korea to escape to either organize resistance or just to exist without these influences. Kim Il-sung's father, after this event in 1919, takes his family to Manchuria, and that is where Kim Il-sung comes of age. Now, we have a pretty big gap in the historical record in this period of time. We really only have Kim Il-sung's word to go on for a good portion of his childhood and teenage years. We're told that he learned of Marxism-Leninism from one of his teachers who introduced him to the work by Vladimir Lenin just before taking power in 1917 called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. That is a work in which Lenin describes how capitalism, when it this is an intense paraphrase, but when capitalism reaches its outer bounds, its upper bounds within one country and has saturated that market, well, capitalism, according to Lenin, then needs more markets, needs more resources, needs more places to expand and to exploit. And that is the relationship that capitalism then has in driving imperialism out of the borders of your standard nation state. Once a place is put under the empire, things can be imported. Labor can be exploited over there for the benefit of the metropole. And eventually, the goods that are actually produced in the home industry can then be exported out to the colonies for even more profits, creating this perpetual cycle of capital imperialism. Now, did young Kim Il-sung read the actual Lenin work, Capitalism or Imperialism, the Highest Form of Capitalism? No. According to Fyodor Tortitsky, excuse me for butchering that name, I've been going for a long time, in his 2025 work, Accidental Tyrant, which I have on my e-reader, but I don't want to pull it up right now. It's a good book too. if you were going to choose between two biographies of Kim Il-sung, both Seth's 2025 work, Forever President, and Tertitsky's 2025 work, Accidental President, are pretty good. If you're not super familiar with Korean history, I'd go with Seth first, but that's going a little bit beyond the auspices of our discussion today. Kim Il-sung was exposed by his teacher to Lenin's work via, according to him, I believe, a pamphlet, which basically gave a synopsis of the work. Now, here's an interesting thing. Kim Il-sung also, presumably in some of these early years, was receiving Chinese language instruction, perhaps in combination with Korean language instruction. And he's going to emerge in the 1920s and in the 1930s as a man fluent in Chinese. He's going to write in traditional characters. When he flees later on in 1940 and is questioned in the Soviet Union in 1941, he's going to write his responses to their questions in Chinese, not in Hangul, the traditional, or the 15th century invented text from Korea. He's going to be fluent in Chinese. And in fact, because Manchuria is this sort of no man's land where everybody who's upset, whether it be there with nationalist China or with Imperial Japan, are going to go, means there's going to be a mixing of Korean and Chinese people. And after becoming a Marxist, even if we're not totally sure, and it's probably doubtful that Kim Il-sung was really a true devout Marxist. We don't have any evidence really that he was fluent in the theory in the way that Mao or Stalin was, or obviously Lenin was. Kim Il-sung seems to like to have taken Marxism and just applied it to his version of nationalism as a means of convenience. And what probably appealed to him in Lenin's work, and what probably appealed to him in Marxism overall, was a path to resisting empire. Remember Lenin's work. Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. So it gives Sung a thing to latch onto to say, okay, the Japanese aren't really the problem, it's capitalism. Perhaps that's what he thought. I don't have Kim Il-sung's writings sitting out. The other thing is that Leninism, as opposed to just Marxism more generally, as I mentioned before, gives you the ability within your own nation, quotes, to give revolution as a vanguard party, even if there is not a international proletarian revolution that Orthodox Marxism would expect. So it both empowers the Kim Il-sung that wanted to be a nationalist, and I think we'll see over the course of this explanation that Kim Il-sung is first and foremost a nationalist and a Marxist very much second, but it gives him also a framework to oppose empire because of Lenin's specific work explaining the anatomy of capitalism's relationship to imperialism. Sorry, I had to take a drink. My throat's getting a little raw. I apologize. I will try to breathe with the diaphragm and keep my energy high for you. We are getting now into the meat of the formation of North Korea. I hope you can see that with the birth of Kim Il-sung and his interactions with Japanese imperialism. Kim Il-sung is going to be 18 years old, 18, 19, kind of coming of age, 17, 18, 19, at the end of the 1920s. And he's arrested for the first time in 1929 by the Japanese and held for a little bit. Now, he's a pretty young man, and someone vouches for him, and he gets out of the Japanese prison. The Japanese, particularly towards the end of their rule, are going to have pretty expansive amounts of political prisoners that are held. And in 1945, when the Japanese are finally expelled from Korea and it's divided at the 38th parallel between the Soviets and the Americans, as those Allied powers roll into Korea, a deal is struck with the evacuating Japanese to and this is done not through the Soviets or the Americans, but by a leftist by the name of Yo Un-yong, Y-O-Un-hyong, Hyong, who is not a communist, but a leftist nonetheless. And he negotiates for the release of what is about 16,000 political prisoners of the Japanese Empire in Korea. A lot of those who are freed are going to make up what is called the domestic faction of the Korean left. during the transition period after Japanese rule, and they will come to be one of the first groups to be purged by Kim Il-sung out of his party, having no base of support in either the Soviet Union or in communist China. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Despite this very short time in a Japanese prison or a Japanese jail or something for being a troublemaker, we're not totally sure about what took place. Kim Il-sung, therefore, for the next 15 years, is going to avoid Japanese prison. He's going to remain outside of Japanese prison, which means he's also going to avoid making some of the compromises that are necessary for political prisoners to get back out of that prison, to be a collaborator, to be brainwashed or something, to basically be subject to the authority of the Japanese. He's going to be unbesmirched with that throughout his time in the next 15 years as the Japanese Empire becomes a war machine and then eventually is ejected from the peninsula. And we do indeed see Kim Il-sung reemerge between 1930 and 1940 as a guerrilla fighter. These are his guerrilla years in Manchuria resisting the Japanese. And he's going to lead a pretty famous raid. I think it's called Ponjobon. I'll put it up on the screen. A raid where he basically, and his guerrillas, he goes across the border, hits a little Japanese outpost right inside Korea proper, and then runs back to Mount Baekdu or whatever on the Manchurian side, and escapes the Japanese after causing damage. It's become this legendary raid where the flea bit the dog, right? The flea of the guerrilla fighters bit the Japanese dog and pissed them off, and he's going to become a wanted man in Japanese Korea and Manchuria. And that's on to my next point, which is that Manchuria itself becomes directly annexed into the Japanese Empire itself in 1931. Manchuria begins to go by the name Manchukuo as of, I believe, 1932, when it is formally annexed into the Japanese Empire. So it's a no man's land. The Japanese realize it's a hotbed of guerrilla fighters and resistance to their rule. And as they're militarizing, as they're gearing up to invade China, they're going to invade China in 1937 and try to bring the whole of China into the Japanese Empire. Hence why China and Japan are involved in World War II, beyond just what we know on this side of the ocean, where the Japanese surprise attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, etc. The Japanese decide to take direct administrative control of Manchukuo. And overall, the period after 1930 represents the most brutal time to be under the yoke of the Japanese Empire in Korea. There is massive industrialization. Manchukuo is seen as a place where it's like you can just start fresh, right? The Japanese administrators can go in. They don't even have to go about appropriating land because there's no administration there. It's a no man's land. They go in. They can start to rapidly industrialize, build factories, build war machines. So they're not just exporting rice from the rice bowl of Korea, but now they're in the 1930s, they're building their war machine directly inside of Korea and Manchuria, Manchukuo. And they're also going to become far more brutal in their tactics of controlling the Koreans. Around 1939, 1940, there's the name order, which means that all people in Korea were told to take Japanese names. The Korean language was once again suppressed. There was volunteer conscription in 1937, and then eventually forced conscription in the 1940s as World War II becomes more intense for the Japanese, and they're fighting in the Pacific against the Americans. And of course, one of the most infamous remnants or facts about this period of time is the hundreds of thousands of Korean women who are then made into quote-unquote comfort women, aka sexual slaves for the Japanese soldiers. And so the trajectory of Japanese imperial rule in Korea is 1910 to 1920, a period of full control and just taking the levers of power, organizing essentially their imperial rule. 1919 is when the uprising happens, and there is that attempt then for the next decade to build a group of Koreans that are loyal to the Japanese by a slight loosening of that control. That's not to say like a liberalization, but just a strategic empowering of certain Koreans in a secret police or in a very small entrepreneurial class that will then support the empire and their privilege, in empowering this old Yongbon class that's lost their status to nonetheless acquire some capitalist wealth and collaborate with the Japanese. And then because they're collaborators and they're part of the subjugation of their own people than to have this distorted, perverted system to actually be even more cruel, to make sure the Japanese don't go, because if the Japanese go, you know what's waiting for you as someone who helped to subjugate all of Korea. And 1920s, as I said, is also when the nationalist, communist vanguard, more radical group emerges alongside the more moderate nationalist group that are Korean Christians that are more maybe liberal or Yangban in their background, so they're not as radical. They're more interested in just self-rule of Korea, perhaps, if we're going to build an informal spectrum. On one side, we have the former Yangban educated literate group that maybe has lost their privileges over time or is looking to have even more privileges by expelling the Japanese eventually and having a Korean nation state, a nationalism that's been formed in the last part of the 19th century as the Joseon dynasty and the Yi dynasty started to erode. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have a more radical group of nationalists, these vanguard communists that want to expropriate all of the land and distribute it to the peasants, to expel the Japanese empire, and to build a Bolshevik Soviet Marxist-Leninist state in replacement of the Japanese, with the ultimate goal of building communism. Now, an interesting thing that goes on in the 1930s as regards Kim Il-sung, some formative moments in his life in the 1930s. One of them is that and this is really interesting, and this is something that is absolutely not in the official biographies of Kim Il-sung from the North Korean state today. I mentioned earlier he spoke fluent Chinese. The first Communist Party that Kim Il-sung joins is the Chinese Communist Party. Remember, I said there's a lot of intersection in Manchuria between Chinese communists and Korean guerrilla fighters. And the guerrilla fighter group that he joins in the 1930s is not just a group of Korean guerrilla fighters. It is a mix of Chinese and Korean guerrilla fighters. And they are resisting the Japanese as of the mid-30s as the Japanese start to use Manchuria as a bridgehead to invade China. They are together in their resistance of the Japanese Empire. The enemy of my frenemy is my friend. And actually, at the end of World War II in 1945, as it becomes clear that the Japanese Empire is going to fall, there is a meeting of the guerrilla fighters in Manchuria, and the Koreans and the Chinese wave goodbye, so to speak, and they go their separate ways. The Chinese to go home to mainland China to fight further in the Chinese Civil War against the nationalists that's going to reignite after the end of World War II, and the Korean communists who are then going to go to northern Korea occupied by the Soviets and participate in what they hope to be the unification of a communist Korea. There is not always smooth sailing between the CCP, and think about it. Kim Il-sung is part of the Communist Party of China speaking Chinese. If that came out in his official biography, a man who will come to later be known for his pure, unadulterated Korean nationalism, he's going to portray this period of time as him up in the Mount Pictou, this very beautiful and legendary mountain peak of Korean legend. He's going to be there as a freedom fighter, all by his lonesome with his Korean freedom fighters, not a Chinese person in sight. And there's an incident in 1933 that goes through 1936 in which Chinese communists become suspicious of the Koreans amongst their ranks in the Chinese Communist Party and begin a purge of the Korean communists because they suspect the Koreans might actually be imperial collaborators. There's a paranoia that sets in. It's called the Minsaengdan incident, Minsaengdan incident. And Kim Il-sung survives that purge. He does not get purged with other Koreans, but he is left perhaps with a scar that will one day influence North Korean-Chinese relations after the Korean War, maybe even during the Korean War. We'll get there. And there's an unsettling that goes on. And so that ends in 1936. And remember, the Japanese now have taken direct administrative control of Manchukuo. And they're going to spend the rest of the 1930s eliminating the resistance that exists in Manchuria. And they're going to be pretty effective at it. And so in 1940, Kim Il-sung and his guerrilla band leave Manchuria and go and enter the Soviet Union. Specifically, they enter Siberia to flee from the Japanese Empire, which is winning in its efforts to put down all the guerrilla resistance in Manchuria as it builds its industrial base and moves through Manchuria as a bridgehead into invading China. Now, the Soviets are suspicious. First, between 1936 and 1938, Joseph Stalin has perpetrated what comes to be called the Terror, in which literally over 1 million members of the Soviet Communist Party are purged, including many Soviet Koreans, that is, Soviet citizens who are of Korean origin or Korean diaspora. Many of them are purged and sent to other places other than Moscow and St. Petersburg, other than high-ranking administrative positions, because this period in the mid to late 1930s in the Soviet Union is one of terror and intense paranoia and suspicion, particularly of people who would represent the more international communist Marxist perspective via the Comintern. Internationalism, more orthodox, quote-unquote, Marxism, that would have been represented via someone like Trotsky, the removed potential other leader of the Soviet Union after Lenin, who's gone into hiding in Mexico and eventually will be assassinated by a Stalinist agent. Anyone representing internationalism, especially if you look international in your appearance, if you are part of a diaspora, Soviet Korean, for example, are put under immediate suspicion, because where do your loyalties lie? Stalin, in this period, moves Soviet Marxism in the direction of nationalism via a policy called socialism in one country. The idea is that instead of waiting, as Lenin was, as Trotsky was at the beginning of the Soviet Union's time, waiting for an international proletarian revolution, trying to foment that, Stalin basically gives up and says, realistically speaking, there's not going to be an orthodox Marxist revolution where all the proletarians simultaneously rise up. We're on our own. We need to build socialism in one country first, which then feeds into this 1936 to 1938 terror, among all sorts of other things going on in that period of time, where people like Soviet Koreans are purged. Okay, that little detour takes us then to Kim Il-sung's time in the Soviet Union in 1940. He arrives into a Soviet Union in the midst of World War II. In June 1941, will be invaded by Adolf Hitler, in fact. And in 1941, as he's being, basically all these Koreans who are brought in, these guerrilla fighters, are like kept in camps in Siberia and basically told, just stay there, we don't trust you. We're not going to murder you or whatever. Kim Il-sung fills out a survey actually in Chinese, as I mentioned earlier. They're not considered to be like disloyal, but they're not trusted. And they're left functionally, as they enter in 1940 and then in 1941, as they're questioned, they're basically left to their own devices for the last 4 years of the war. I misspoke. They're left to their own devices for a little bit, but pretty soon, like I said, Adolf Hitler is going to start his campaign to invade the Soviet Union in 1941, Operation Barbarossa, if memory serves. I'm not a military history guy. And the Soviet Union is faced with a conundrum. The command of the Soviet Red Army in Siberia is met with a conundrum. The eastern flank, the southeastern flank of the Soviet Union that borders China, borders Korea. It's not to say it's impervious to the Japanese, but it is to say that the bigger focus for the Red Army is clearly the German front. After Germany's invasion, the Battle of Stalingrad is on the way. And so the Soviet Red Army starts to move forces out of Siberia, out of the eastern part of the Soviet Union to face this existential threat. There is no guarantee at this time that the Soviet Union is going to successfully repel the German invasion. We look at it now and say, oh, it's so obvious. Napoleon lost, Hitler lost. Stalin really, there's a lot of historical debate about what was going on in Stalin's head, but the synthesis is that the Soviet Union was not prepared, was not on guard, not even really raised their defenses, even though they were warned over and over and over again that Germany was about to invade. Stalin sat on his hands for a considerable amount of time, even after the invasion started. So the Soviet Union is fighting for its life against Nazi Germany. And it is in this moment that a Soviet commander, I can't remember the name or his rank, but basically there is a Soviet in the Red Army who is in charge of the eastern flank who says, we need meat bags, we need people to help us shore up this eastern flank just in case the Japanese attack, while we move all these resources to the west to repel the Germans. And so out of necessity, Kim Il-sung and the Korean Soviets are now brought into something called the 88th Rifle Brigade. The 88th Infantry Independent Rifle Brigade, I forget the exact term. Hold on, I'll find it. The 88th Separate Rifle Brigade, beginning in 1942. I've also seen it called the 88th Separate Infantry Brigade. Just a question of which translation you're looking at. And their task is to be part of the Red Army, to wear the little Soviet star, to be part of the Soviet military. And so at this moment in time, Kim Il-sung is also becoming quite fluent in Russian and is now fighting. I guess he also was farting in the Red Army. How could he not at certain points of time? Fighting in the Red Army for the Soviet Union. Again, Kim Il-sung, the ultra-nationalist, the person who will eventually create a state ideology called Juche, which is all about autarky and the Soviet nation existing for itself and resisting all types of outside influence. Kind of reminiscent of the Joseon dynasty, as some of the historians I read, including Armstrong and his work, The North Korean Revolution, 1945 to 50, would point out, paralleling some of the paranoia about outsiders and the desire to be completely isolated and just exist in perpetuity as you are. That ultranationalist Kim Il-sung, at this moment in his life in 1942, as he joins the Red Army, is in a foreign army fighting for the Soviet Union, and previously was a card-holding member of the Chinese Communist Party, fighting in a mixed group of guerrilla fighters of Chinese communists and Korean communists. You won't get that in the official North Korean history books. I think it's endlessly fascinating to see where this man, when you peel back all of the propaganda, where he actually came from, and to consider for a moment what Kim Il-sung might have been were he not the way that he was. Well, that's a bit cryptic, but I'll save that. Now, you know that the tide begins to turn in World War II, that in fact the Soviets do repel the Germans at Stalingrad, just as Napoleon had been repelled from his invasion of Russia in the 1800s. And in 1943, after the Soviet Union has begun this process, and after, of course, the Soviet Union has joined the Allied powers, the United States, China, Great Britain, fallen France, exiled France government, on and on, there is a discussion that begins to happen as the tide turns, as the war begins to go against the Axis powers. What will the world look like after Nazi Germany, after Imperial Japan, after Italy are defeated? And in November of 1943, FDR and representatives of Great Britain and China, I think Churchill was there, I'm not totally sure, they put out a declaration in Cairo. Now, Joseph Stalin is not present in Cairo, but he will be present a month later in Tehran, the Tehran Conference in December of 1943. But the reason I'm bringing up the Cairo Conference is because there is a discussion about the post-war circumstance in Southeast Asia. There is a determination that Taiwan will be returned to China, that Manchuria will be given to China, and for our purposes, that Korea will be made, quote, free and independent. Quote, mindful of the enslavement of the Korean people, after the war, in due course, Korea shall be free and independent. Now, Stalin is not there to agree to that, and we know that after the Japanese surrender, that the Soviets will be part of the Korean occupation. That is indeed planned. Stalin signs on in Tehran a month later to say that, yes, the Cairo Declaration, the plans you have for a free and independent Korea, I'm good with that. Now, that's important for a number of reasons. Number one, because that's what happens. Okay. Korea after 1945 is made free of the Japanese and will eventually be independent, though in two parts, which is the second aspect of why this is important. And that is to ask the question, did Joseph Stalin, from these early moments, Cairo, or accepting the Cairo Declaration in Tehran in December of 1943, was Joseph Stalin always conniving to split the Korean peninsula? Was he insincere? That was the belief of a lot of people prior to the opening of the Soviet archives. The Cold War historians, who were then counteracted by some of the revisionist historians like Bruce Cummings, believed this basic story that from the very moment that Joseph Stalin started to do geopolitics in the 1920s and 30s, that he was always designing a huge communist sphere of influence. And therefore, even when he accepted the Korean as free and independent, according to the declarations that he was signing himself onto, that he never truly believed in it. That's not true. It seems as though Stalin, and I'm leaning here on the work of Armstrong and Tertitsky and Michael Seth, it seems as though Joseph Stalin was actually potentially content to have Korea be free and independent, maybe communist run, maybe a communist satellite state or something under his influence. But there was that independent leftist I mentioned a long time ago, Yo Un-young, who's not a communist, and Tertitsky mentions it's possible that like Stalin saw him as a unified, independent Korean leader. In fact, the evidence seems to be that Joseph Stalin was not particularly interested in Korea in the way that the Tsar, Alexander, and then Nicholas II, Alexander II and Nicholas II were interested in it during the Tsarist times. That Stalin was more concerned with Japan, more concerned with China, which towards the end of World War II, remember, is a battlefield of the Chinese and the Japanese. And there's a Chinese nationalist contingent that is the government of a unified China at this period. It's more likely that Joseph Stalin was interested in meddling in that affair and meddling with the United Front and trying to manipulate the communists to win that ultimate conflict, that ultimate civil war that would then put a communist China on the border of Russia. A communist China that includes Manchuria. And so therefore there is no other buffer than China. And so therefore between your buffer state of China and then what comes on the outside of that, Korea, it's not necessarily as important to Joseph Stalin. Not long after that, in Yalta, Joseph Stalin agrees to declare war on Japan eventually. He hasn't formally declared war on Japan. Japan hasn't formally declared war on the USSR. He's going to cancel that neutrality in April of 1945. And so I think that's a good moment to bring us then to the surrender of the Japanese and the period between 45 and 48 when North and South, the northern part and the southern part of Korea, start to diverge. And remember, since 668, when the Silla Kingdom unified something that looked a little bit like modern Korea, or at the very least since 900, when the Goryeo Kingdom again unified Korea, up until 1910 when Japanese annexes it, but even throughout the Japanese imperial period. So from 668 until 1945, Korea is more or less a unified singular entity. There are lots of machinations of kingdoms, and obviously it becomes a vassal of China and becomes annexed by Japan. But the point is, here we are in 1945, the moment that should be the liberation of Korea as Germany loses in April of 1945. Battle of Berlin will be in June 1945. Trying to remember. And of course, then as the focus of the Allied powers turns to the Pacific theater and the eventual complete defeat and unconditional surrender of Japan, what should be a moment of joy and jubilation for the Korean people to finally be, as Cairo promised, free and independent, becomes a nightmare as Korea is divided in two.